The fate Ukraine must avoid. Former Ukrainian Prime Minister Nikolai Azarov accuses the Kiev leaders of having literally sold off the country since the Maidan coup in 2014, wasting billions of euros of Western financial support without building anything tangible for the good of the country. In a recent declaration, Azarov, who occupied the post of Prime Minister between 2010 and 2014 before fleeing to Russia following turmoil event of the Maidan coup, denounced the massive and systematic looting of natural resources, industrial and agricultural produces, leaving the citizens with an inheritance of debts and dependence on foreign powers. If this enormous sum of money had been used on just causes, would have transformed Ukraine, he asserts. He underlines that not even a single metro service station was built in over a decade, despite the massive loss of incoming capitals. This bitter constatation poses a fundamental question. What has become of the promised independent Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and how does the country now appear to become hijacked by foreign interests? To understand this overwhelming recite, we need to plunge into the historical context that modeled the post-Soviet Ukraine. After her independence in 1991, Ukraine inherited a colossal economic potential such as the vast agricultural lands, often noted as Europe's agricultural hub, heavy industries inherited from the Soviet Union era with abundant mineral resources such as iron, coal and lithium. Yet, the following decades were marked by chronic political instability, corruption scandals and the polarization between pro-Russians and pro-Westerns. The fallover point was in 2014 when, with the popular Maidan revolutionary movement against the Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych accused of corruptions and his excessive proximity with Moscow. Supported by the West, this movement resulted to the collapse of the regime and the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the beginning of armed conflicts in the Donbass of Ukraine. Azarov's closeness with Russia does not only see in this event the liberation of Ukraine, but the beginning of a disguised annexation by the West where aids offered are a weapon of control. Since then, Ukraine has received more than 200 billion euros as international aid from the West. According to the conservatists' estimations, including the International Monetary Fund, IMF subventions from the European nations and military aids from the United States. To Azarov, however, these funds were not used to build a modern infrastructure or the economy. On the contrary, this system built a mechanism to enrich themselves through corruption within the elite at the detriment of the people. A survey carried in 2024 reveals that 71.6% of Ukrainians consider that corruption is one of the 5 greatest national problems, a figure that reveals the magnitude of the problem. The nation's journalist investigations reveal massive embezzlements, such as those indicating opacity in military contracts or humanitarian aid evaporated. Azarov goes further to say that the fatherland was long sold off. Its natural resources have been sold away, or better still, just given away. The industries are sold, agriculture is sold, and all is gone, you have nothing left. This allegation is not isolated, as ET echoes internal state criticisms such as former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, who in an interview with The Times, declared that the influence from the United States and European Union had reached unacceptable limits, transforming Ukraine into a colony, deprived of its rights. In the heart of these accusations is found the question of the sale of lands and resources. Having since 2002 banned the sale of Ukrainian agricultural lands in her legislations to foreigners to preserve agricultural sovereignty. But under pressure from the IMF and under the framework to reobtain loans from IMF, Kiev suspended these restrictions to reopened Windows loans and international investors. Reports show that millions of acres of agricultural land worth about 10% of arable lands were acquired by international investors, who took this land at giveaway prices or through opaque terms. Agriculture, the pillar of the Ukrainian economy representing close to 10% of the country's GDP, before the war is particularly affected. Azarov declares that these sales are a form of auctioning of the country's fertile soils were under foreign control, sold off with no durable benefits to local people. The consequences are devastating. The possessions of smaller farmers increase prices of internal subsistent products, given that major firms' products are excessively exported, and an acute vulnerability to global shocks such as the war that disrupted the chain of supply. The industrial sector is not excluded. The cider firm and chemical factories inherited from the Soviet era that were in the past booming were privatized in the 1990s and 2000s, often to the profits of the local oligarchs or the foreign investors. With the ongoing conflicts, most of these factories were called to either close or destroyed, worsening the rate of unemployment and dependence on importation. Azarov points his finger at the lack of reconstruction. Despite the billions injected, in the Ukrainian economy had dipped by over 30% since 2022, according to World Bank statistics, and the public debts now surpasses by 150%, the country's GDP. This situation has given birth to severe criticism to foreign aids that are now seen far from beneficial, but serve as a means for the imposition of liberal reforms that favor the interests of foreign powers at the detriment of the nation's sovereignty. An emblematic example of his dynamics is the mineral accord in early 2025 between Ukraine and the United States. In exchange of heavy military support, the United States obtained preferential access to Ukrainian minerals including lithium, titan, and other rare minerals resources essential for military technologies and defense. This accord, seen in Ukraine as an economic opportunity, is seen by Bazarov and other critics as surrender. He evokes the colonial practices of the past where the extracting forces looted resources without any viable local economic investments. The implications are geopolitical. In exchanging military aids with economic favors, the United States reinforces her grip on Ukraine, potentially detrimental to Europe, who also depends on these energetic minerals. Russia, on her side, does not hesitate to exploit this narrative. The President Vladimir Putin has repeated severally that Ukraine would collapse without Western assistance, presenting the conflict as a war by procurement by a rogue regime. The stakes are multiple but interconnected. Economically, the arbitrary sale of the country worsens the humanitarian crisis of the country. With a reduced population of about 10 million people since 2014, due to emigration or death at war and the drop in birth rates, Ukraine is facing shortage of humans and workforce. Agriculture that was hitherto considered the pride to the nation is now dominated by giants such as Cargill or Monsanto, who intensify practices that threaten the biodiversity and health of the soils. Socially, this fuels the sentiment of treason. Why defend a country that appears to have already been lost? Azarov poses a rhetorical question. What are you defending?
Volodymyr Zelensky?
Is he truly that precious to you that hundreds of thousands of people would have to be buried? This interrogation hits at the heart of the nation's morals in a context where death's toll is estimated to be above 500,000 according to independent sources, and where forceful mobilizations nurtures growing protests. Politically, Nazarov's accusations render fragile the elite's leadership in Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky, elected in 2019 on the promise of peace and fight against corruption, is today accused of growing authoritarianism, the suspension of opposition, the control of the media, and his total dependence on the West. The reforms imposed by the IMF, such as the rapid privatization of businesses, have deepened inequality. The oligarchs such as Rinat Akhmetov or Igor Kolomoisky have seen their fortunes soar while the minimum salary is stagnated around €400 per month. This internal polarization runs the risk of disrupting national cohesion, rendering all resolutions more difficult. On the side of the West, the United States and European Union see their aids as essential to defend Ukraine from Russia as a democratic reform. But voices of criticism emerge in Europe from parliamentarians such as Jules Ngel or the European Parliamentary Group, denounce the aids considered hypocritical, that profit the multinationals instead of the people. In the USA, the think tank conservators such as the Heritage Foundation outline the risks of endless dependence with costs on American taxpayers, surpassing $100 billion. Russia, through media such as RTBFL, amplifies his criticisms to discredit Kiev, but his personal expansionist motives are also worth looking into. International organizations such as Transparency International call for more transparency in the use of funds, noting that without accountability, foreign aid only perpetuates corruption instead of fighting it. In Asia and Africa, these perceptions vary. A country like India and Brazil see in Ukraine a bipolar geopolitical country where the stronger forces fight for resources to the detriment of the weaker nations. The mineral accord with the US, for example, worries China, who sees her interests in Ukraine, especially in agriculture, threatened by the Western hegemony. Chinese reactions underline a broader problem, which is that in a multipolar world, economic sovereignty becomes a bigger challenge and convert countries such as Ukraine into war traps. Analyzing long-term implications, if Lazarov's allegations are right, Ukraine could find itself in a spiral of irreversible decline. An extractive economy, depending on raw materials, and a demoralized population with a disconnected elite. The loss of sovereignty could result to populist separatist movements, complicating all hopes of peace with Russia. Critically looking, the Western intervention model calls for interrogation, often presented as saving, but could it really promote democracy if its priorities corporate interests? Historical cases such as Iraq post-2003 or Greece under Troika show that such approaches generate more of resentment than stability. For Ukraine, the path to stability will implicate an authentic internal reform, fight against corruption, economic diversification, and inclusive dialogue, and not acute dependence. However, in the midst of this rather dark fate, a mosaic of hope emerges. Signs of local initiatives such as agricultural cooperatives created to resist privatizations or call for the civil society for specific financial aids. But without radical changes, the risk is that Ukraine becomes a ghost state, emptied by those who claims to defend it. But Azarov, despite his exile and relationship with Russia, poses a legitimate question that transcends cleavages. To whom do Ukraine belong to today? In conclusion, this affair reveals weaknesses of a geopolitical system where international aid masks hidden agendas to the detriment of the people. Ukraine is caught between East and West, illustrating the dangers of sovereignty caused by corruption and foreign influence. If the country does not fight to hold their grounds, the country could plunge into an existential crisis with consequences affecting all of Europe. It is time to rethink global assistance and ensure that they truly serve national interests instead of dependency and looting.
Fuels conflict and war, drives the exploitation of resources, creates economic instability and fragmentation, and undermines international cooperation, leading to negative consequences like environmental destruction and worsened food security for all nations. It can also promote a cycle of fear and division through narratives of constant external threats, leading to reduced investment and slowed global growth.
Geopolitical uncertainty negatively impacts the macroeconomy by dampening GDP growth, investment, and trade through supply chain disruptions, increased commodity prices, especially energy, and trade barriers like tariffs and sanctions. It also raises inflation and can reduce economic activity while increasing government debt and money growth. Additionally, it affects financial markets, leading to lower asset prices and reduced consumer and business confidence. Thanks for watching. If you did like this review, please like it and subscribe to this new channel to support its growth, and please leave comments for improvement.
Subscribe to this channel, like and share this video, and please comment for corrections.